Loading. Welcome to Access the Animus.
Hello everyone and welcome to a new video here on Access the Animus. Almost 1 year has passed since the release of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and after the main game we had the chance to play two major expansions. The first one, Wrath of the Druids, led us to Ireland during the reign of Flann Sinna, and the second one, Siege of Paris, set historically in France 8 years after the main game, showed us the Viking invasion of Francia during the reign of Charles the Fat. All the fans had their expectations about these two major expansions, and if some of them have been satisfied, some others were disappointed, and in this video we would like to sum up the ones that we think were the biggest missed opportunities connected to the main story expansions. We will touch upon some major topics that we think deserved a bit more focus on, and that, in our opinion, should have presented a better connection with the main game, namely the missed opportunities in the Order of the Ancients and Hidden Ones storyline, in the Isu one, and in terms of historical accuracy. Lastly, we will show you how the developers commented on some of the raised issues, using their answer from our own interview about the Siege of Paris DLC organized by the Mentors Guild, and a few comments shared online with fans about the Wrath of the Druids expansion. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking it, subscribing to our channel and turning the notifications on so you won't miss any of our future updates. And with that out of the way, let's have a look at the main missed opportunities of the Assassin's Creed Valhalla Year 1 DLCs. Assassin's Creed Valhalla is an immensely big game, not only in terms of map, but also in terms of content. While playing it, we did get the feeling that the developers used it to give a closure to some of the open threads from the recent and even old games of the franchise, but they also did leave some new leads here and there that could have been used for future expansions, in order to give a sense of continuity between the main game and the following releases. Sadly, at least in the first two DLCs, most if not all of them have been left unused, making the stories of the two expansions pretty much self-conclusive, which in itself brought the connection between them and the main game to be only at surface level. Let's take a look then at what we believe to be the most visible and relevant missed opportunities from the last two expansions. Number 1. The historical leads. For what concerns this topic, the issue is very similar for both Wrath of the Druids and Siege of Paris, and it is related to the fact that these two expansions were meant for all the players, regardless of whether they beat the main game or whether they had just started playing it. In itself, it might even look like a commendable idea, making the new maps, settings, and gameplay additions available at any time the player would choose. But as it is often the case in this kind of situation, world, setting, gameplay, and now even content accessibility seem to come before the narrative aspect. So with what seemed and still seems to be a very odd move, the story of both expansions was designed to make it look like the events in the DLCs were happening at the same time as those in the main game, and more specifically those of its early arcs. This not only meant that the characters in the expansions never properly acknowledged the ending of the main game, and in some cases Eivor's growth as a character throughout it, but it also created this weird situation where events from the expansions that are historically recognized as happening after the last historical events of the main game are actually considered as taking place way before them, and the same goes with historical characters' deaths and actions. And ultimately, this direction even had a major influence on the absence of portrayal of the Order of the Ancients in these DLCs. Now, we can say that in Wrath of the Druids this issue appears more subtly, and it consists in not acknowledging the ending of the main game in the events that the player live while they are in Ireland, and thus also not picking up from them. So for example, there is almost no reference to what happened between Eivor and Sigurd, her relationship with the Odin she had in her blood and mind, and of course the pretty huge find of a humongous machine that can create alternate realities, with the equally important realization for Eivor that Valhalla was an illusion. On the contrary, in Siege of Paris there are way bigger issues that really clash with what we have learned from the main game. The first example of that is that a historical character that partook in the siege on the Viking side is surprisingly missing from the expansion, even if he was historically one of the key figures of the actual siege. We're talking of course about Rollo. Now, we met Rollo during the Essex arc in the main game, and while playing it in a fully fictional arc, we got the idea that that arc was also there to show a historical character in his beginnings, while also forging a friendship and alliance with Eivor that would likely pay off when they both would partake in the Siege of Paris, as historically he was one of the leaders of the Viking army during the siege. As we know though, that never came to pass, and that's because having him in the Siege of Paris DLC that could be played at any time during the main game would have spoiled the events of the Essex arc itself. That approach is not just one of our theories or hypotheses, it actually comes from a comment by one of the Siege of Paris developers, content director Paul Fu, who took the time to participate in a recent interview that we were able to organize thanks to the Mentors Guild program. We wanted as many players to have access to the Siege of Paris expansion as possible, even players who have not met Rollo in the main game. In order to make sure that the story remains accessible to everyone, we decided to keep Rollo out of the focus of our expansion story. The actual siege in history was massive in scale, and has started all the way up north in Louvain. Many cities and villages were razed leading up to Paris. Rollo still has a place in the siege's history and could very well be part of one of the invading Viking factions. Again, we understand the point behind this choice, but for players who have already met Rollo, it is kind of a big immersion breaking point, because during the main story, we grew closer to Rollo. We could also decide to have him as one of our Jom's Vikings, who would basically join the Raven clan and tell stories about his past while on the longship. So eventually not being able to even just see him or talk to him during an invasion where he was a leader and not just another warrior did feel pretty disconnected from the main game. Another example which has been mentioned pretty frequently comes from a dialogue during the first encounter between Eivor and Toka in the Siege of Paris DLC, which takes place in the settlement before leaving for Francia. In there, she mentions some characters that Eivor meets in some of the narrative arcs from the main story as people that she contacted to convince them to take part into the siege. One of them is Jarl Hemming, who dies during the Nottinghamshire arc of the main game, and as such years before the Siege of Paris, and the other one is Halfdan Ragnarsson, who historically died in 877, roughly 10 years before the events of the DLC. So yeah, we do agree that this may be good for someone who starts playing the DLC very early in the game, but it also breaks the immersion for those who, on the other hand, played the expansion after finishing the main story, especially because this expansion is set several years after the end of the main game. Number 2. Templars. Or not? In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, we get to finally experience the proper birth of the Templar Order through the Order of the Ancients ending and the documents found in King Alfred's study in Winchester. This part of the narrative showed how Alfred destroyed the Order of the Ancients, or at least its English branch, from within, by using an unbeknownst Eivor and sometimes even supporting her as he was planning to move from an organized cult of worshippers of the old gods, that is the Isu or First Civilization, to a Catholic-driven order oriented towards the Christian God, who was then deemed to be the one and only Father of Understanding. In addition to that, at the end of the Winchester arc, in the Temple of Mithras, Eivor finds a letter that hints to 2 Order of the Ancients branches or sects located in Ireland and Francia, which at the time sounded just perfect considering that the announced DLCs were actually set in Ireland and France. So of course the DLCs had a huge potential to continue what was established in the Order of the Ancients ending by seeing how the remaining branches of the Order were faring and conversely how the Templar Order could have taken over in Ireland and France. Of course we now know it wasn't the case, and when at last we landed in Ireland and Francia, we found ourselves in front of 2 factions that walk like Templars, they look like Templars, they behave like Templars, but surely they were not Templars. For starters, the Children of Dano from the Wrath of the Druids expansion had a huge potential to be a great extension of the Templar/Order of the Ancients storyline, with Dano being a mother goddess of the Tuatha De Danann pantheon of gods from the Irish mythology. On paper they looked so much like the Order of the Ancients in terms of worshipping ancient gods and getting a hold of the population while they were at it. It would have been nice, for example, to see how a Christian king like Flann Sinna could have been instrumental in the Templars' attempt to transform the cult following Alfred's Reformation. Or maybe we could have witnessed a proper clash between the old ways, as in the Children of Dano/Order of the Ancients, and the new ones in the form of the newly forged Templars, and their fight to cut the dead branches of the order still tied to the old pagan cult. The same reasoning sadly goes for the Bella Torres Dei group in the Siege of Paris DLC. Same premise, same potential, same missed opportunity. When asked about the motivations for not making them a branch of the Order of the Ancients in Francia, narrative director Joël Genis answered, "One reason is we wanted a group who could align closely to the themes of our story and characters. Their unique obsession with deliverance has special resonance with the events of our story. In addition, we also imagined that in the future this group would become subsumed by the Templars when they rise up and spread across the globe." The feeling we had is that maybe during the early planning of Assassin's Creed Valhalla and its DLCs, the idea was to actually develop this narrative thread as hinted at in the main game, but maybe during production, this whole part got cut off or modified, again to make it easier for the fans who might start playing the expansions before finishing the main game, and thus, in this specific case, to prevent the DLCs from spoiling the Order of the Ancients ending from the main game. In our very personal opinion, this is probably an even bigger issue than what happened with the historical dating, because in this case, we missed the chance to establish the continuation about the story of such an important topic of the franchise as the development of the Templar Order in that period. And honestly, while everything could still happen in the future, we do believe that it's very unlikely that we'll visit Ireland or Francia in this time period again to actually have a bigger or better development of the Templar history in those regions. Another missed opportunity in this historical period comes from the fact that Charles the Fat was the great-grandson of Charlemagne, who was hinted at and pretty much confirmed as one of the leaders of the Order of the Ancients in Francia. This relation between the two characters could have been used and developed, even just to give a better explanation of the reason why we get to find a Joyeuse sword that belonged to Charlemagne himself, left in an abandoned Hidden Ones bureau sealed since the 4th or 5th century. About this topic, lead quest designer Christopher Nonis stated that, though the Hidden Ones left in force before the time of Charlemagne, there could well have been a Hidden One presence still in Francia that had access to the bureau. If the sword made its way to the bureau after Charlemagne's death, which it must have, perhaps a Hidden One had something to do with that. And that's absolutely possible, especially considering the presence of the Hidden One Abbo Cernus, as we explained in one of our previous videos, but it would have been way easier and more understandable to find the Joyeuse in Charles the Fat's hands, or at least in one of his palaces, rather than in a bureau of the ancient Roman Hidden Ones. What do you guys think about this? What were your expectations about this particular topic? Let us know in the comments as we move on to the next missed opportunity. Number 3. The elusive and very hidden ones. Well, this chapter will be very short, because the missed opportunity in both DLCs was to actually show them. In Wrath of the Druids, they are pretty much absent throughout the entire story and world of the expansion, and there is little to no mention of them or their presence in Ireland, present or past. In Siege of Paris, players are able to visit a Hidden Ones Roman bureau and 3 ancient Roman ruins belonging to the Hidden Ones, which bear the very same mood and tone to the ones in England, that is, beautiful structures and architecture that has been completely abandoned for centuries. In the DLC, we initially see that there seems to be no Hidden Ones in Francia, and the narrative seems to imply that they left the region because of the defeats that they sustained in another country, in England. So yeah, not the best look as to why the DLC did not contain any assassin character, but again, the issue didn't stop there. At the end of the Hidden Ones related quest of the DLC, as most of you already know by now, it does feel pretty disappointing to feel the presence of an assassin, hear their footsteps, read their letter, which was even signed as AC, and not meet them eventually. There lies the missed opportunity concerning the Hidden Ones in Siege of Paris. You walk amidst their ruins, you are so close to them that you are almost about to meet them, you even get to know that there's a backstory about them with Yabo Cherno's story, but yeah, you still don't get to see them or talk to them. When asked about these topics, lead quest designer Christopher Nones answered, "The focus of the DLC was on the historical siege of Paris, but we still wanted to give fans something to discover related to the Hidden Ones. The Hidden Ones Bureau and their caches at the Roman excavation sites allowed us to touch on how the Brotherhood was faring in this part of the world during this time. We wanted to focus on quality for the DLC, so most of our efforts were put towards realizing the main quest arc involving the Siege of Paris itself. Telling a story where you interact with a member of the Brotherhood would require a lot of resources to be satisfactory to us and fans both, so we made the difficult choice to hint at their presence instead. We won't delve again in the irony of not having assassins in an Assassin's Creed installment. Oh, I guess we just did, but we could not avoid including their absence among the missed opportunities here. Number 4. The Isu Memories and Mythology. This time we will start with the Siege of Paris DLC, in which we simply do not experience memories of our Isu ancestor Odin, and in which the only mention related to the first civilization is the much appreciated mystery of Saint Denis and the riddles tied to it. As for what concerns Wrath of the Druids, we have already touched upon the first Civ flaws of the expansion in our ending analysis, but to briefly mention them here as well, we could say that the missed opportunities here boil down to 3 specific situations. The first one does not originate from the DLC itself, but from the Isu barracks vault hidden beneath Stonehenge in the main game. While visiting it, players can find some inscriptions in the Isu language signed by the Isu Lu the Polymath and Morihan, who are described as belonging to the Celtic Isu pantheon and whose names were not random, as Lu and Morihan were actually members of the Tuatha Dé Danann pantheon of Irish gods. So of course, going to Ireland, a lot of hardcore fans hope that the hints in the main game could find a continuation in Wrath of the Druids, exploring or expanding the position and story of the Celtic Isu, especially after the main game showed that there were different groups and clans within the Isu society, but once again, none of that was used. To be precise, in the words of assistant narrative director Hugo Sahuke, within the DLC, Lu has been assimilated to Cuchulainn, the original owner of the Gaebolg spear that players obtain at the end of the very lore-wise confusing boss fight with Balor, which just so happens to bear our second missed opportunity here. In the main game, we got used to our visions in Valka's hut, where we experienced the memories of Eivor's Isu ancestor Odin, and in the Wrath of the Druids it looked like the devs were trying to achieve the same result, but this eventually brought a very different outcome. In fact, the boss fight with Balor brings a number of issues if we try and interpret it as we did with the visions in the main game. First, if it's a memory from Odin's life, Eivor's visuals should have shifted to Odin's, and as mentioned by assistant narrative director Hugo Sahuke, the gender issue was flagged early as a bug though, so it's not a design mistake. I assume there were more critical issues to fix, and this one didn't make the cut. It's sad, but always happen. Second, this boss fight appears in the game with no context whatsoever, and there is no explanation about the reasons why it is happening or where and when it takes place, and it proves to be incorrect or at least very convoluted on the mythology side of it too, as we already mentioned in our analysis of the mythological ending of the DLC. Instead, this could have been a nice chance to expand what was shown in the main game about the Celtic Isu, or even just to add more info about Odin's story during the Isu era, but ultimately this looks as a section of the DLC pretty much orientated towards gameplay and rewards, as it was suggested by the assistant narrative director himself in a very honest tweet about the development process of this part of the expansion. Lastly, and this is more of a minor one, in Wrath of the Druids we can witness the powers of the Leafall Isu Stone. As we mentioned in one of our previous videos about this DLC, within the Irish mythology the Leafall Stone was only one of 4 treasures of the Tuatha De Danann pantheon of gods, along with the Sword of Light, the Spear of Lu, and Dagda's Cauldron. These could all have been turned into Isu-like artifacts and technology or illusions, and they would have tied perfectly both with the Irish mythology and the idea of a Celtic subset of the Isu, but again this was not explored nor represented in the expansion. But in all fairness, this also likely happened because of the scope of the DLC itself, which was also reduced at some point. And don't even get me started on Lu's spear actually appearing months later as a standard reward spear from the River Raids mode. And with that final rant, that's it for today's video. What do you guys think of our selection of missed opportunities for Valhalla's expansion? Did you have different expectations than us when approaching the DLCs, and was there anything you would have liked to see in them that you couldn't find? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.